Hello everyone, today we talk about the military organization of the Low Countries during the Low Middle Ages. So this time span roughly comprehended between the second half of the 11th and the beginning of the 14th century. And I know it kind of probably disappoints you because the most interesting part of the Flemish military history is in fact the one starting with the 14th century proper, with 1302 Battle of Courtrai or Kortrijk, I believe it's pronounced in Flemish. That was one of the most important battles of the Middle Ages, arguably the greatest victory of medieval European commoners in this first half of the 14th century. That saw, in fact, this militias a bit from several parts of Europe actually, but chiefly also from the lowlands, defeating alone, I mean just as a mono-arm army, in fact, of infantrymen, of commoners, the flower of the European feudal European cavalry, of the time. In that case, of course, the cavalry of the French king. So, but it's exactly because of this importance that the Low Countries have in the hidden military, in medieval warfare, in that specific half of a century. It's definitely very important to understand what happened before, because you can't understand how they got there, and they were able to achieve this result. Apparently out of the blue, because as we will see in the 13th century, definitely the Flemish infantries had given substantial sign of their development. This is something that happened elsewhere, also in northern Italy, in central northern Italy. But definitely there are different stages of development in this sense, and that it's very useful to confrontate all the various developments in Europe, and this is basically what I'm studying as a living, and it's extremely complex. It can't be explained so quickly, but let's say that definitely there were certain political and social premises that brought to this development and to this eruption, if you want, of the 14th century infantry warfare that eventually died out, actually, because before the Swiss infantries of the mid 15th century, that are something even tactically very different from the ones of the first half of the 14th. Let's say this wave of commoners infantries actually had died out. It had died out seemingly with the mid 14th century. Probably had to do with the plague, with the fact that the commoners were some of the, especially in the cities, were the populace that suffered kind of the most demographically. So also this demic impact was a cause in the process, but it's also looking at the development of these communities in the previous centuries. The Low Countries are definitely very fascinating because they developed just like other areas of Europe, more than other areas of Europe actually. They came second only to the Italians. Certain autonomous municipalities that were at this time actually framed within certain principalities in turn, that were feudal in nature. This is particularly important to understand because when you confrontate especially the Italian and Flemish armies at this time, that had the strongest infantries around during the 12th and the 13th century, you realize that these two areas were somewhat still, they shared many similarities actually. So these rich cities of burghers involved in trade, etc., with these militias. Local militias were chiefly made of infantrymen, etc. But they also were consistently different from a political point of view, especially in the degree of emancipation from the feudal nobility, from the feudal system, generally speaking. And let's say that, to make long story short, actually the Low Countries had they were still until the very beginning of the 14th century, were very much framed into still a kind of a feudal order in many ways, whereas if you look at the Lombard or Tuscan communes, this had fundamentally emancipated from feudality at the point that they had actually become the feudal lords of the same feudatories. So this is a complex story, but this also corresponded, as I was saying before, to different timing in the development of these various infantries, which is particularly fascinating, especially looking at Italy. That is kind of an exception, because Italy develops infantries, much better infantries, by the way, and much larger and much earlier than other countries at this point, including these ones that in the 14th century would go from the other side fundamentally, but they do not make it like them to eventually defeat, say, heavy cavalry at the beginning of the 14th century, because at that point, at least in the Italian peninsula, or in communal Italy, if you want, better, the classes of the burghers, let's say, were still kind of going down, and they were already going down. Whereas in the rest of Europe, that was kind of coming later comparing to Italy. These infantries were still to develop at their fullest. So that's what starts happening at the beginning of the 14th century, and that's how eventually this thing is explained. But already during the 13th, you can notice that there was a great development of these infantries that, albeit not making it to defeat alone cavalry, so not being tactically, not making it to become tactically independent, still had given proof of their development, of their strength. The only problem was in the fact at the time that the 13th century is the apex of feudal warfare. It's the apex of the feudal nobility, etc. As I've said, in the mid-14th century, Europe will get, in a certain sense, terms of warfare re-feudalized, right? It is the development actually of certain principalities. It's still in a kind of a unifying measure, but it's mostly the lords who make it to the top once again. And this, in the phase that approaches the 14th century, however, the low countries, the local municipalities were trying to shake off the yoke of partially of foreign, let's say, domination, and this was also, by the way, all intertwined with the autonomistic ambitions of certain local princes that, given the particular geographical position of the Low Countries, given the politics of the time, were tending to fundamentally to side with the local militias to autonomize from the other major powers. And this is a bit the fascination with the Low Countries that you probably have, because it's the Low Countries have an old history of autonomy that is dated back to even previous to the phase that we're discussing today. In the centuries we will be observing, the majority of the principalities that went to make up the Low Countries were technically fiefs of the Holy Roman Empire. Albeit the Count of Flanders, the most powerful of the lowland princes, was a vassal of the French crown. So this entailed, and you understand how the Low Countries were an area of frontier, right? So an area in which there was no real central power. There was a set of principalities that were pretty vivacious and still theoretically framed into this feudal net of relations with other dynasts, etc. As you know, the Holy Roman Empire, especially from the 13th century onwards, starts progressively fragmenting from a political point of view. Flanders are in the northwest of Germany, so they are in a peripheral area. They're not easy to control. They're very thriving and dynamic communal centers that are difficult even to frame into a feudal into a feudal power, and they also expand because they also enter in. They fight actually against other powers. Think about the Battle of Waringen of 1266, if I'm not wrong, which the Count of Brabant, Duke of Brabant, excuse me, wins over the Archbishop of Cologne, etc. So this is an area that historically, since the Lotharingia, let's say, was a bit unframeable in any sense, geographically, because there is actually no real border between France and Germany, if you think about it. There is this area. The Netherlands had been always kind of isolated a little bit, given that there weren't major centers around, so they always gained this kind of autonomization since very early in time. Let's say that there were also an area exposed that had been exposed to the Viking raids back in the day. So the Carolingian administration had entrusted since those times a lot of autonomy rights to these communities to defend themselves, so to organize themselves from military defense, and this had originally been done through the local nobility, as these areas were actually at the time not developed at all. That Northern Europe fundamentally is kind of lags during the Middle Ages back from behind Southern Europe, but still has a higher growth pace, so that in proportion it kind of expands more quickly. So these were areas that, in the ancient world, if you think about it, they were rather depressed, but fundamentally through this organization, the new trade routes that are that are shifted towards the north, etc., are able to exploit several factors and to start growing, to start becoming very important economical centers. You know that the Flanders at this time were some of the wealthiest areas of Europe. They usually imported, in fact, wool from England. They had this textile industries that eventually sold their products on the markets in the Champagne fairs. They were fairly well connected within this sense between northern and southern Europe, because basically everything around the North Sea gravitated economically around Flanders. But they also had this intercontinental trade. They were well connected with Italy in itself, although the Italians were concurrents to them, and they even managed fundamentally always to get the upper hand, to enter in the English markets, etc. But there are still communities that grow very fastly. They don't have the ancient and much older urbanization of Italy, but they grow fast and they expand. And that's why also, if you look at in perspective, the outburst of the 14th century can be read in this progressive growth of those centuries that kind of slow down for a while in the 14th, but kept expanding eventually into the modern age, etc. So the area of the county of Flanders was previously a mark. So this frontier area that were created by the Carolingians with certain specific military duties that other internal core lands of the empire, let's say, didn't have. And this was naturally because ruling this area, these territories required special defense arrangements to prevent incursions from the outside imperial territory. The encapsulation actually, however, happens later. Another proof that actually encapsulation has nothing to do with the second invasions, because encapsulation in Flanders, like in many other places, actually occurred at the very end of the second invasions. In the earlier mid-11th century, that's where you have the most important fortified castles into Flanders. And it probably didn't also have much to do with an external threat, but like for most of the phenomenon of castellation, it happened because the local aristocrats wanted to control better the local territory and to structure their lordships at a territorial level, etc. And already from this time, that is very foggy, because still it's not such an enormously developed area. We don't know excessively much, but we already know that the local communities were already kind of organized and kind of distinguished between the militia and the nobiles. That means fundamentally that there was already within the county of Flanders, how it eventually had become a distinguished, discriminant factor, let's say, between the troops organized by the local towns and the ones of the feudal aristocracy in some ways. And there was this distinction, in fact, between the ville and the oppida, so respectively the towns and the castles. Eventually, this was an area that also underwent further feudalization in some way. The original, let's say, we know that from at least the 10th century onwards, Flanders was divided in these administrative districts called as châtellenie. If I pronounce it the French way. I'm not sure whether there is a kind of a transliteration from a local term. I think there was. This is a French term for sure. I mean, it's surely a French term, but I think it was defined like that. And and in Flemish, in fact, there were there was the châtelaine in French that corresponded to the burggraaf in Flemish. So you realize also this area between the Latin and the Germanic word, let's say, so with the Romance and Germanic languages. The châtelaine, naturally, at this time, you have to think that France was the most culturally influent country out there. So in terms of French ambitions on especially in the county of Flanders, we perfectly know much, because also actually the same count of Flanders entered into the French system in a way or another. It was actually one of the great lords that participated in a certain sense to the same French affairs. So there was a strong Francization of the local institutions, for which you find châtelaine instead of the burggrafen. Let's say there was the local the majority speaking. The title given by the speaking majority in Flemish. So the role of the châtelaine was the same, more or less, of the vicomte in France. So they had fundamentally they were one step under the greater count. So they were the vassals fundamentally of the local count. And in Flanders, they were the several châtellenies were centered around the on the principal towns, or fortified settlements. For instance, Ghent, Arras, Ypres, Bruges, Lille, and Saint-Omer. Ghent would be Gant, and Bruges would be Brugge, I believe, in Flemish. So, but these were still, important cities that remained, in fact, also in European history, and also because Flanders dramatically transformed historically in some of the, bloodiest battlefields of the continent, especially during the modern era and beyond, telling the truth. So these were still fairly. They didn't see enormous amounts of warfare at this time. There weren't, let's say, major threats like could exist. The local activity was. The feudal NATO relations still maintained, a certain order, and fundamentally these were areas that thrived also because they weren't pressured by particular warfare. The major clashes would happen, in fact, with the French invasion. at the very end of this period, because that's where the Kingdom of France would start, expanding in there, and it would basically, that's what France tried to do in a nutshell. That those were the two major directions, the wealthiest areas of Europe, Flanders and Italy. That's where the French have always tried to expand, and rightfully in this very rational perspective. And the title of Châtelain was like many other feudal titles, was now fundamentally hereditary. Albeit the theory was that the count could dispose of whoever could obtain the title. So let's say that at least by the mid 12th century it had become hereditary, and sometimes it was exchanged. Also, it was interchangeable with the title of Vicomte. So they could actually equate one the other. So this probably happened because, as we've seen, these were fairly militarized areas back in the day of the invasion. So this probably had also helped, like in other areas that were very heavily hit by the local, by the second invasions, to kind of centralize power, like for the sake of emergencial military organization. And that's why originally the Castellani, also in Latin, were so interchangeable by the local count. But in this period of between the 11th and the 14th century, Europe obviously seizes this, and feudalism kind of expands. So these areas start acquiring this more strictly dynastic character, for which the title that before was just the one corresponded to an appointment, fundamentally passed to become hereditary, and therefore also deeply rooted at a local level, and corresponding also to a certain degree of fragmentation. So the Châtelain, Vicomte, or Castellanos, whatever you want to call it, was, however, responsible for raising and leading both the local feudal levies and the urban militias, fundamentally. Now, there weren't just urban militias. As a matter of fact, these were areas that were developing also in the countryside, so there were definitely also peasant militias, as always, and organized even as communes. So let's remember that in here, cities, that were developing, but also the countryside was doing. And the city, unlike in Italy, doesn't have the power to fundamentally expand far beyond its traditional districts, nor at this time to even contest the local government to the feudal nobility. They're still expanding in a kind of still ordered and framed way into the feudal hierarchy, and these officials are the ones that were deputed to raise the local military forces. And as we've said, however, Flanders distinguishes itself rightfully for the qualities of its communal militias. That were pretty some of the most advanced, as we've seen in Europe at this time, and they, as it happens with other areas, we have the same problem. For instance, for Italy, for knowing how that happened, is that we don't actually know when the first communes were born and how, and therefore also how the military institution was formed. But we can imagine that there was a local military service that had always existed even into the previous centuries for the bare necessities of military of emergencies and so on. And these now are framed into the newborn communal governments, fundamentally. And in the case of Flanders, the first mention that we have for communal militias is 1127. Obviously, they existed before. That's pretty normal. And they probably started to develop consistently in the last quarter of the 11th century. So just like in Italy, by the way, which is very interesting because These two regions were at two different levels of stages of development, but actually they seemingly developed this institution in the same time. So in this sense, the Flemish were even more precocious in relative terms. The very first communal militias we are informed of are the ones of Ghent, in Saint-Omer and Air, I believe it's pronounced. And we know that already this Flemish communal militias had elements of they were mostly foot armies, right? This is what the commoners were about. This is particularly important. We are still in feudal Europe. Never forget about this, especially in these times. In the 12th and 13th century, the dominating element is cavalry. There is not, in the battlefields of Europe, an army of infantrymen that can work by itself. They have to fight necessarily alongside cavalry in order to achieve victory. They assist cavalry. Infantry, European infantries at this time are very important because cavalry can shield behind them, can get supported by them during combat. This is evident everywhere in Europe, even during the Crusades. But still, these infantries cannot go out there alone in the field and hoping to resist to heavy cavalry. They won't make it. They won't make it until the first 14th century. It is debatable, naturally, when this had started, because even in the 12th century, in certain areas at the border of feudal Europe, actually saw the existence of consistent infantries that were supported also by the terrain, etc. As infantry will generally keep doing. Look at the Flemish infantries during the first half of the 14th century. They were fighting always either behind a ditch or something. So there was this need, but it was still, in fact, this was the major tactical problem of infantry. They were kind of defensivistic in nature, and they couldn't basically pass at the attack. That was their main problem. The best thing they could do at this time was to resist to the cavalry charges, but effectively, for instance, they could break them, but they couldn't pursue them, as it would have happened during the Franco-Flemish War. In fact, some of the bloodiest, some of the bitterest losses of the Flemish armies happened when they broke their phalanx, let's say, and that they started running after the French cavalry, and this reformed and attacked them when they were in scattered formations, inflicting very, very heavy damages. It's already in Europe. It's only in the mid 15th century that you have, with the Swiss infantry, finally, an infantry that can advance and offend effectively, even against cavalry. Before, you don't have. This is the major difference in medieval warfare between what happened in the first half of the 14th century and then 1 century afterwards. And they are two very different types of warfare. You can argue that with the Swiss pikemen, you already are in pre-modern, fundamentally, Renaissance warfare. At the beginning of the 14th century, Europe was completely different. And it was brutally modified by the Black Death in the mid-century, and that was also a major discriminant. But this was the deal even before. Before the 14th century, these infantries couldn't make it alone against cavalry. But they could provide, very interestingly, first of all, this solid bulk of spearmen that were definitely the standard component of these infantries by large. I mean, that they definitely, when you look at communal armies, you can find so many specialists that now we will list, but these were usually in smaller numbers. The majority were just spearmen to form this solid, more or less solid block of infantry to absorb, for some time at least, the attack of the enemies. At this time, really, cavalry was the protagonist of the battlefield, so you very rarely find clashes between infantrymen in open field. It's pretty rare. So it was mostly to absorb cavalry, trying maybe waiting for their own cavalry to attack it on the flank or something like that. But they weren't expected, and they couldn't, in fact, last for long in the open. However, these armies also had other tactical components, always of infantry actually. But we're talking about archers that were definitely not existing in large numbers at this time in these armies. This is true also for Italy. By the way, even in Flanders, like in all the rest of Europe, the crossbows starts to basically substitute the bow. This is particularly true in these urban environments where you know that the bow fundamentally is a difficult weapon to use. You need a lot of exercise. It takes years to become a good bowman, whereas a crossbowman can reach very good military standards even just after a couple of months of training, right? So crossbows were also pretty effective. These urban communities were also the ones that had the technical know-how how to build this machinery. Let's say they had the technology for doing it more effectively, and especially resources, because the know-how wasn't a big deal, but still, sometimes you look at the arsenals of these communal armies and you say, wow, I made a video about that. I think it is, if you give me a second, I can search for it. Well, I don't remember. It was something like the wealth of communal infantries or something like that. So that can be useful as a foreword, even partly on this topic. Even if that concentrated on Milan, but it's not that different after all. In the essentials, from Flanders. So what I was saying here is that there were other specialists, and especially other maybe not non-strictly military men, not strictly fighting force, but individuals like pioneers, technicians, and all other craftsmen substantially that could be found in these cities because they were experts in their craft. They were they knew how to build stuff and how to make armies work, and just think how the logistical needs to serve an army of thousands of infantry, like infantrymen, like the Flemish ones actually were, because as long as you have like even a couple of hundred of knights, you can effectively raid one place and in order to forage and to sustain yourself, eluding logistical problems. When it comes to move like thousands of people independently, from where they're fighting, obviously the war horses are still an additional element, etc. But it starts becoming imposing, also logistically speaking. But this is the key point: is that these cities had the logistical resources in order to put armies on the march, and this was definitely spotted immediately. Obviously by the same local feudal powers throughout Europe. You can see how, albeit the feudal world, kind of the feudal nobility, deeply despised commoners, and whoever was not a nobleman, the feudal armies of knights were definitely very often supported, especially from a logistical point of view, by the communal, by the cities, and because they could provide enormous quantities of resources at once, and also this technical know-how was particularly useful in siege warfare and for all the operations that this entailed, including, for instance, surrounding a fortified place that you can't do really with cavalry, because that would be your elite wasted in duties that every guy, every footman with a spear and a shield can do at the end of the day. So this is still important, because you realize that there was always a strict cooperation between the feudal elites and the local communities, the urban communities, of what were commoners effectively. Always bearing in mind that the latter were confined to a condition of tactical, political, and psychological inferiority by the feudal elite at this time. This is a bit also what helped the commoners at the beginning of the 14th century to recover those strengths, and because they were effectively oppressed and raging and violent. These weren't definitely also the peaceful commoners that were just about civilian crafts, so that they could be extremely violent as well, and also had the violence of the military non-experts, let's say, so those who could effectively give great proof of courage but not much of great technical skill. Just remember that the great victories of infantry in the early 14th century came effectively from non-professionals of war, like commoners. Like at the Battle of Courtrai, the majority of those who stood in front of the French cavalry and its terrible charges were people who had never taken a weapon in their hands in their life, or at least they definitely didn't make a living out of the profession of arms. And this is also another topic that is important, because effectively communal militias will progressively decline during the later Middle Ages, while mercenarism will be on the rise. So that, let's say, commoners will be increasingly more gentrified. We have seen before that in the Low Countries, there were some cities, but historically these were still fairly non-urbanized areas, or lowly urbanized areas. So they also, the initial population came also from a kind of a more, I can't say tribal or strictly Germanic environment, but still they came from a world that was more apt, definitely, to war and to, at least to the exercise of arms in some form, than what they were effectively now in the 13th century, when they were just rich burghers who lived in their houses, in cozy houses, in more or less cozy, by the way, in the cities, and effectively started even to despise peasants in turn, because this also happened, especially towards the late Middle Ages, that the urban elites now equated themselves, especially in these places, like to the feudal nobility, to the feudal elite, and there were also many intersections in this sense, and looking upon with disgust at the peasant community. So, and I believe that the burghers in the commoners in this sense were a bit more ferocious, even the feudal elite, towards the peasantry than what is all often portrayed. But not that that many people take such things into consideration today, but still could be thought. So interestingly enough, the Flemish communal militias used trains of equipment and baggage wagons, and these wagons being actually and generally taken into battle with the army. And some of them were even had this communal standard mounted on them, a bit like the carroccio, the same thing that the Italian communes were doing. So these were substantially wagons that were loaded with certain symbols of the local commonalty and the local communities. The saint, protector saint, to which that actually embodied more than a symbol than the city itself, because this is often let's say misinterpreted. It actually represented the commoners' community in itself, because the local lord that ruled over these cities was effectively a lord coming from a noble family that had his own coat of arms, its history, its sense of belonging and identity. The Carroccio style wagon was more the banner of the people, of the commoners, and of the communal institution in itself, not much of the city in itself. This is important to stress because medieval communes were never completely detached from the feudal elites, not even in the most radical cases. So there was always an institution within the city. It wasn't the city to be an institution in itself. Let's say the feudal elite considered the city more like a thing on its own, because it definitely wasn't very happy of seeing these communities of burghers arming themselves and even competing with feudal power. So they obviously recognized it at a point because they were obliged to do it politically, etc., but even institutionally. But still, it was something different in nature. Still, very, very great divider, let's say, between the actual nobility, and the commoners. These wagons we talked about could be used sometimes either to shield the infantries or to protect the rear of the army. Much has been written about this because sometimes in these battles, and this happens actually for every kind of witness of the employment of wagons in battles, that these wagons were normally deployed on the rear of the army because that's where they would stay. That they had all the supplies in there, or the equipment, the camps, the treasure, and all that stuff. So they would obviously remain in the rear. So many historians have interpreted this like they were deploying them in the rear, in part, besides all this, also because these wagons could form a sort of barrier, not to make the army flee when it was attacked from the front. So having kind of a wall in the rear not to escape. This is, sometimes it is true. This has happened, but you should see that more as a line on which to fall back in case to make a desperate resistance in case the army was broken fundamentally during the fight, and that was definitely a desperate measure that wasn't obviously to be the situation was practically already lost if ever such a thing ever happened. But still, someone could put up a fight. It happened, actually. It's plenty of medieval battles. I was studying one just last week in which troops being assaulted, the army fleeing fundamentally. Some of the troops entrenched themselves into the camp, and they resisted for quite a while. By the way, this is typical, actually, in every battle. Every time in history you find that during the retreat there is a bunch of people who stands there and fights to the death, even to allow the an easier retreat for the others. So these are all things that can happen. That these wagons were actually, especially in the case of Flanders, were actually deployed to form barricades, or to even hold the, to put an obstacle in the rear of the army to prevent escape is most of the times debatable. Let's say that the wagons were more dynamically used the more you go east in Europe, and naturally there is also the most famous case of the Hussites that used this wagon forts very, very effectively, sometimes not just defensively but even aggressively. But those are an exception. Starting in 15th century, and the use of these wagons is pretty common in all the other armies at this time, even non-communal armies, and it generally, was normal to have these things around in itself. But definitely, a communal army would usually have a larger baggage train alongside with them. because of the same size of these armies and the logistical needs, etc., the number of people that were in the army as well. So the option that these were used also to theoretically, form a line to hold a possible retreat is in part plausible, because every obstacle poses as kind of a psychological problem, but it's still not such a decisive factor. And even, especially if you look at the tactical developments of the battles of this time, you realize that it wasn't quite of a thing as a factor to be taken into consideration, even at a moral level. So these Flemish cities could field a really impressive amount of troops, and William Le Breton claims that, probably with some exaggeration, that Ghent, that was the most important city in Flanders, could field at its own expense something like 20,000 men. It's probably now, of course, there were cities that could, this is actually a lot, even for a city like Ghent. But yeah, I mean, big cities in Europe around could do similar things. I mean, if you look at the armies of Cologne, for instance, I've read that they could have similar, if not larger, troops. If you look at Lombardy or Tuscany, you find that local communes that definitely could field impressive armies sometimes. However, this seems to be an exaggeration, because there is the specification that these troops were everyone at the expense of the city. So most of the times, like it happened in Middle Ages by rule, these armies were not fielded just by one city at once, but they were usually a league, a coalition of some sort. So there were troops coming from literally everywhere. So finding an army of 20,000 men is quite of a big thing, but it was theoretically possible if you put everything together. That it was just one city it's implausible, but there is also to say that there is that in theory, I mean on paper actually, if you look at all the men that were eligible, at least for military service, it's perfectly plausible that Ghent and the surrounding countryside, in the surrounding district, could field such a number in theory. I mean, that there were enough troops that theoretically could be called at least to arms. Then that this would present to the call, it's wholly another matter, and this is how most of the political problems revolved around at the time. So yeah, on paper, if you look at these cities that could be of tens of thousands inhabitants, of hundreds of thousands inhabitants, why not? There surely were a proportion of able-bodied freemen, of men that could go there and with an arm. Considering the surrounding countryside as well, that still made up the largest amount of the population. So yeah, but it's still theoretical. These weren't fielded because it was mostly a matter of expense. It costed a freaking lot of money to make an army move. This wasn't, armies like 20,000, the amount of 20,000 were something that were recorded every once in, generations. This high medieval systems couldn't afford to mobilize regularly such amounts of men. It's impossible, and it would have destroyed their economy effectively. And it could be done, by the way, only for causes of major force, let's say, which are also rare to happen, because especially as the political situation is pretty fragmented, you don't have a pressure from someone, a metus hostilitas of someone who wants to come to conquer you. Well, it's like, why would you even field them? You would field much smaller amounts of troops. In fact, that's the reason why, for instance, with the French invasion of Flanders, well, you see that these communities fielded now quite big armies that were also the product of several cities put together, right? But nevertheless, the fact that there are historians of the time that tell you that look at this city, it could feel, it can feel 20,000 men. It still meant that this community could feel an enormous amount of troops for those time standards. You don't find fiefs that can feel such amount of men. And this big amount is given also by what we were saying before, that these weren't like 20,000 cavalrymen. These were actually 20,000 commoners. So most of them were at best equipped with kind of a iron helmet, a shield, and a spear, with some other protection like gambits and stuff, but not more than that. So that's essentially light infantry. And you can field lots of them, but they also are not going to make a lot of damage, and unless this doesn't happen at the beginning of the 14th century, where numbers, in fact, with mass and spirit, actually made that possible as well in terms of resilience and all. So as we were saying before, the knights, however, of the Communal army of Flanders remained the principal military force in the lowlands until essentially the 13th century, because also in here there is a kind of, the county starts a bit coming apart in terms of central of unique central direction, fundamentally. In part also because of the rise of the cities that naturally put there a bit more of energy, of kinetic energy into the system, and made the whole thing more difficult to control. But there were other kind of political crises in this sense. And this is a bit the reason why the same knights started to grow. Cause and consequence, let's say, of why the knights from the roughly the second half of the 12th century started to become more and more heavily reliant, dependent on the communal contingents. So it's as if all these local chatelain and burggrafen, etc., started even being more connected to the respective urban communities in terms of military organization. Especially after the death of the Count Philippe d'Alsace, 1168-1191, this process seems to have been accelerated. And also having a strong political figure is important here, because the tendency is always kind of it's not really always to tear apart, but when there is something pre-existing that tries to keep together forces that are growing tendenzially, that's the direction you're gonna head. Always with bearing in mind that still the individual powers want to expand in turn and create something greater, more functional. And naturally, the County of Flanders remained as a feudal entity in administrative and political administrative sense. The Flemish cities had their military levy, for which, at least by the end of the 12th century, every man aged between 15 and 60 years, or, well, this could vary actually, depending also on the city, was obliged, however, to possess or bear arms, according to his fundamentally economical means. This is a standard pretty much elsewhere in Europe. Anywhere else in Europe, it's the exact same form of recruitment. So there is naturally a political control on the property of the freemen that have that correspond to certain classes of recruitment fundamentally, so that everybody has, the wealthiest have to go to war equipped with more armament, the others have a lighter equipment, etc. This is particularly typical. Sometimes the levy could start with the age from 16 or 17 or even 21, and up to 60 or whatever. So these prescriptions are very theoretical. I mean, the most important ones were actually on the actual wealth that you had, because as it happens in other areas of Europe, at this point the government didn't actually care whether you individually and physically went to war, but if you could pay someone else to go to war for you. And this was typical, by the way, of so many places everywhere. So there is no great difference between the feudal levies or the communal militias, and that's also a part of the reason why the rise of mercenarism during the 13th century and the boom in the 14th. The Flemish towns were divided into districts of recruitment, each one with its own constabularies, and that were in turn led by constables appointed by the aldermen. So the aldermen are these, they were the members of the municipal assemblies or councils, right? This is a term that I mostly hear especially in English law, but let's say that this is just there are many other equivalents, politically speaking, all over Europe. So these were usually the wealthiest burghers that had even a kind of clientelar relation with the population, so they could field actually troops on in the sense on their own, based on the various districts, and they were politically influent, etc. And eventually it seems that this districtuation became more capillary, for which every freeman was also identified, let's say, by its own street of residence. So, and the interesting part of the story is also that, as in other areas of Europe, actually, by the in this case, for Flanders, by the mid 13th century, the richer townsmen were now issued to serve actually as cavalry, and not just as infantry. This is important and reveals in many ways more than a military change, which probably didn't occur in the tactical practice, a political change, which means that now there were certain townsmen that had made it to the top. Making to the top meant, in this case, having the power and wealth to fight on horseback. That at the time was the major, the military dominating factor, let's say. And this means also, together with that political fragmentation of the county that we were talking before, that fundamentally the local nobility was also growing closer, let's say, also from a political point of view, from a cultural point of view, to the local burghers, and also intermarrying and therefore forming political ties that would prove crucial, by the way, for the same autonomization of these local cities, because now the local noblemen weren't much tied to the bigger guy at the top, like the count, the powerful count, but they were more interested in sowing these relations with the local communities and being at the head of them, given that they were expanding very, very fast. And this is actually this fact of serving on horseback was nothing new. Actually, there are many areas of Europe when you read that commoners or freemen, independently from blood, let's say from noble lineage, had to serve on horseback. This is the case of Italy, where, in this sense, nobility, even within the cities, was just sensual. That meant, as long as you and this is happening a bit all over Europe practically. You know, that as long as you can, if you have the means to fight on horseback, you're so wealthy, you can fight on horseback, you're automatically already that powerful as an individual, like a feudal lord, fundamentally, like a knight, let's say, better, and that's what your community expected you to be, at least on the battlefield. Naturally, with some differences, because it's still, you know, the true feudal elite, it was still kind of way more advanced usually in terms of military experience, etc. Most of these burghers actually paid someone else to go fight for them, even on horseback. So paying from their purse, but you know, not risking life in person. So even sometimes when they were fielded, definitely even as city cavalry, they weren't probably as good, as trained, as professional as the feudal elite. This can get very blurry, because if you actually, I study from I have a very close perspective on this, because I study exactly this in my research, and the situation is particularly blurry. You can say that there is a tendency, but you can't automatically say, you know, that if a guy belongs to the nobility is a better knight, especially at the individual level, that, let's say, a city knight. Things start getting more evident, especially at a collective level. That is what formations do and how they are trained collectively. Definitely, we know that while the feudal elite, with castles, living in countryside, etc., and doing war all the time, was always trained for war, and was always trained collectively, participated to tournaments, etc. The city burghers, did very similar things, actually, if not the same things, but they spent also much less time doing them, because also they had other business, like the economical one, for instance. But the two things had always also partly gone in parallel, so it's still also different to categorize so sharply. We know that this obligation to serve on horseback was introduced in Brugge, for instance, Bruges, in 1292, and there were, in this case, very interesting, 5 distinct classes of cavalry, based on the individual wealth of those who made them up. And the 2 first classes actually were expected to ride on a barded horse. Now, having a barded horse, I don't have the source with me, so I don't know now what barded actually means, because barded, I believe in this case, means actually a horse with armor, right? And this is a time in medieval warfare where, in fact, you start finding even the first actual evidence of metal armor for horses, but it still was something extremely expensive. So this case of Bruges, or Brugge if you prefer, is particularly meaningful because relatively to the wealth of these communities, because they even had 2 distinct classes that had to have a barded horse. Normally, if you look at the other recruitment classes pretty much elsewhere in Europe, the top class had to serve on horseback with an armor for the knight, but they didn't usually make mention for the bardment over the horse. This is very meaningful on how wealthy certain burghers could be in such communities. Another important factor in the military organization of Flemish cities was the belonging to the guilds. Now, you know that medieval towns were effectively a set of clienteles that were associated to these guilds or corporations or arts, whatever they were called differently in various areas of Europe. And there was naturally this was done because there was some additional cohesion attached to it. I mean, you tended to fight with people you lived with, you worked with, you had economical interests in common. This was perfectly fine, and this was also the primary cause of interscene fight, clash between the within the same cities, actually, the various factions and the various that were struggling for power within the city. And in Bruges, or Brugge, the communal militia was subdivided into 12 voden, each one composed of 96 burghers, that in this case means cavalry, and 511 guildsmen. The appearance, however, of an actual military organization based on guilds, meaning that every guild had actually to master his own militia, is something that appears very late in the 13th century. While before, the normal mastering occurred on the base of the respective town quarters. This is particularly interesting because, for instance, it's different from Italy in this case, because Italy had probably larger and older cities, in parts also actually wealthier cities, and in Italy you rarely find, in parallel to Flanders in this sense, anything like this, like that it was the actual guild who had a kind of a relative military organization on its own. The recruitment was based on the quarters or sextiers or the other the urbanistic repartitions. And in the case of Flanders, I believe this is the guilds had such a great importance exactly because the cities were kind of smaller. So what had actually grown much at that point had been the actual guild, so these actual economical organizations, trade organizations that had become relatively proportionally to the cities that were on average smaller, kind of more important than what the city actually how it was physically subdivided. So this can be an explanation. There is in this evolution also some further modification. For instance, there is the introduction of professionalism in some form in this, with certain, especially by hiring certain or maintaining at the communal expenses certain companies of specialists, chiefly crossbowmen or even archers, that were meant to be kind of at least a combat-ready force, if not a permanent force, that was in fact for which the town paid money to keep trade. This happened also elsewhere. In Europe, we have, in fact, in Italy it happens the same, with especially bodies of crossbowmen. So this idea of at this time, crossbow all over Europe is really becoming one of the most important weapons ever. It's really conditioning the especially siege warfare, but also pitched battles, etc. So the fact that even communes invest all over the continent into these specialized companies of marksmen is, in my opinion, pretty meaningful. Usually, well, okay, let's skip this. Maybe it's not so important. The Flanders were the low countries were also relatively heterogeneous, right? There is this most kind of coastal area was also more developed, more commercially far-ranging, let's say, and involved into international trade, etc. Then there were other more other different organizations. For instance, there is the and especially the ecclesiastical powers of the Low Countries. For instance, in the Prince Bishopric of Liège, the city militias had been established very early, even earlier than in the most urbanized areas of the Northwest. They already existed for sure since the mid-11th century. The one of we, for instance, is recorded as far as early as 1066, and may have existed even as early as 1013. There is therefore this early military organization in the episcopal of these episcopal centers. Even before the formal recognition of the actual commune in the second half of the 12th century. This is important because it reveals to you how important ecclesiastical principalities were in certain areas of Central Europe, and how much the bishops in this area had taken over actually the city, and in part even choked the communal development. This is especially the case of these cities between France and Germany, also in the Rhineland. Think about the great ecclesiastical principalities in Germany, where you find, in fact, that the city is effectively controlled by a local lord, usually the bishop, but it could be also a secular lord, let's say. And the reason is that the more you go southeast, let's say, from Flanders, and the more the less cities are developed, as a matter of fact. So you never find in Germany, for instance, these cities that had, a district that they ruled on their own, like in Italy, for instance, where the communes even expanded their power beyond, and even on other cities, or even on feudal lords. So in these more central areas of Europe, you find instead the communities of burghers that are actually very well organized. Think about the freie Reichsstädte in Germany that are granted civic rights and trade rights, etc., to prosper, but they're very well organized, even militarily speaking, but they don't have the power to actually expand beyond outside the city walls, because the lords of the land all around are still more powerful than them. So in this sense, it's a bit the Flanders is mostly the county of Flanders proper is the area where you find in the Low Countries the most developed cities, while in others the feudal element was stronger, and was even, as in the case of Liège that we have seen now, able to frame the city militias under the episcopal power that at this point even controlled in part the communal development. Sometimes actually the communes were able to defeat bishops, but this usually happened more when it was a city, let's say a commune, or that usually led by a lord, by the way, fighting maybe against the city of a bishop with communal militias. So it's a bit more complicated. There are battles like this, like the Battle of Steps, for instance, that we'll see afterwards. So we know that in the mid-13th century, the militia of Liège and its dependent towns was organized in city districts. Liège in itself had 6. These districts are compared to the Wouden of Bruges that we have seen before, and within which the militia formed actually many units of known as Wing 10, that basically means of 20 men, that was in their each one under an NCO known as Wing 10, I believe it's the pronunciation. And although this institution was intermittent because it was abolished a few years afterwards and then reproposed and reorganized in 1276. Talking about the actual strength of these armies, we can look at some number. So the county of Hainaut could field 340 knights and 340 other armored horsemen in 1172. In 1183 we know that it could also field as much as 10,000 infantry. What is particularly interesting is that of the knights that the county could field, many of them were also provided by foreigners, actually, for people who came at least outside of the county. For instance, in Germany, where it was full of let's say of professional knights, although that were curiously not freemen, that are the ministeriales, that are actually pretty famous. But yeah, in Germany at this time, especially towards the 13th century, had and in southern Germany had like 90%, if not more, of knights provided by this non-free, of this servile militia, fundamentally, that rose as actually in origin as a simple administrator drawn from the servitude from the serfs, that actually rose to, into the social hierarchy, and albeit remaining a serf, could fight as a knight. And many of them, especially towards the 13th century, effectively were used as mercenaries. They could be bought and sold because they were not freemen. And so you find, in this case, also in the Low Countries, many of the ministeriales being used also by the local powers. Some chronicles say that the Duke of Brabant, at the Battle of Steps of 1213, lost something like 30,000 men killed and 40,000 captured. Now, it's a very big number. We don't actually know whether it's plausible or not, but it's still probably speaking for the numbers of infantrymen that the Duchy of Brabant was actually very famous for. Some of the most prized infantries of the Holy Roman Empire came this time from the Duchy of Brabant. They were used also very, very effectively sometimes. By the way, just a word. The Battle of Steps was fought, in fact, in this Steps is in Belgium, and it was fought on October 13, 1213. It was a clash between the bishopric of Liège and the county of Laon against the Duchy of Brabant. It was a Brabant defeat, as we've seen, and it's actually an interesting battle we might comment on someday, and into which the Liège militia actually had some importance, and butchered, in fact, the Brabantin infantry during the battle, and following a slaughter. It followed a slaughter, actually. And you see, especially in this geographical area, that infantries were developing fundamentally, especially in this 13th century, and having a kind of a dynamic role. Just remember that in the year after, at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, the Flemish infantry in the Anglo-German army was butchered to the death, taking many French with them. After that, the bulk of the army had already been had fled, and well, these Flemish mercenaries, remained on the field. They created a sort of phalanx, and they made themselves, they got killed till the very end. So this is important because it witnesses this elements of infantry revival already in the 13th century that are otherwise unknown in the previous ones. And in this case, this area of Europe, they mostly came, in fact, from the Low Countries. On one occasion, we know that the Count of Flanders, that was, as we've seen, the most powerful of the lowland princes, that led 500 knights and 1,000 armored horsemen in the field. Is it possible? Yes. Also considering that there were other knights of unspecified number that the count held within his many castles. It seems that at the end of the 13th century, the counts of Lodz, Julier, Lamarck, Luxembourg, and Namur, and also the Lord of Fauquemont, could raise something like 220/50 feudal cavalry, and the Prince Bishop of Liège, whose power we have already assessed before, could field alone some 700. This is not a few. The same Duchy of Brabant could field at one point 700 men at arms in the 12th century, and however, it seems that the number had declined at the end of the 13th century to only 500. And also now this number could be fielded because of the German mercenaries from the Rhineland area that the Count could muster, proving that the feudal strength now was kind of loosening in the area. Also, in terms of who could participate to the army, and there is this increased dynamic market, growing dynamic market of mercenaries that could be effectively hired even from different areas, from the one of your own fiefs. And in fact, these mercenaries were to make great part of the cavalry of the principalities that we have just mentioned, if you noticed. And yeah, so that would be a lot to add, but I think I stop here for this time, and we will focus in the future mostly actually on the infantry developments of Flanders during this time, but we kind of skipped, and we will get there, talking about some battle and also about the more strictly tactical developments, as today we just observed the organizational ones. So for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.